It's showtime, folks.
Absolute Cinema. This is Justin Lynch, Bioc Memes, back for another video. Today we're doing, you guessed it, a draft video. At the time of this recording, by the time you see this recording up on the YouTube, it'll be pretty much exactly 72 hours, 3 days until the 2026 NHL Draft. The Blackhawks walk into this draft with the 4th overall selection. So I thought I'd go through my draft board one final time ahead of the draft, my final rankings in terms of players that I'd like to see the Blackhawks target in this draft. So, figured, very close to the draft here, we kind of have a pretty good idea of, where things stand at the moment, how it's likely going to play out. Got plenty of time to watch tape on all these players and sort of project, best fit in terms of future Blackhawks lineup. So I think we've had enough time to figure that out between draft lottery day and now. So I figured likely what will likely be the last draft video before the draft. Maybe I'll do a mock draft between now and then. Maybe we'll see. But likely the last draft video, pre-draft video, I guess, until we break down what happens Friday, Saturday in the future. So that's what we're getting into today. So starting off, we'll go in order from, best fit to worst in terms of players that, Hawks should be considering up his pick, which I don't think it's a very expansive list, right? I think there's only a few players likely that will be selected here. But yeah, we'll just start from the top rope here with the number one player here. Number one on the board for the Blackhawks has to be Ivar Stenberg. I don't have Gab McKenna here because we already know what's going to happen there. If there's one certainty of this draft, it's that Gab McKenna will be going first overall to the Toronto Maple Leafs. We know it's going to happen. That's going to be the case. So yeah, no McKenna on the Blackhawks board. I think from pick 2 onwards at the Sharks, I think that's when things start getting interesting with this draft. That's when we can kind of start having debates in terms of what player goes there. That's the draft effectively begins with the Sharks at 2, right? The Leafs may have the first overall pick, but we know McKenna's going to be the pick. He's a consensus number 1. The draft effectively begins with San Jose Sharks at pick 2. So yeah, if Stenberg is there at 4, I think for the Blackhawks, absolutely take him. I think unfortunately, as we kind of veer closer and closer to this draft, it kind of seems more and more likely that Stenberg's not going to be there for. We won't know for sure until draft day, but the odds have sort of gone against the Blackhawks' favor there. And it just, you have a hard time seeing 3 teams pass him up, right? We know Toronto's going to pass him up, but between San Jose and Vancouver, I see a hard time envisioning a world where both the Sharks and the Canucks pass up Stenberg. It could happen, you never know. Maybe the Sharks take a defenseman. Maybe the Canucks prefer Malhotra. We'll see. But the way I see it going, I see it being McKenna number 1. I think the Sharks probably still take Stenberg despite their defensive needs. I think the Canucks take Malhotra, and then I think the Hawks will be picking the best defenseman of the lot. That's the way I see it going. But if the delusion fantasy world scenario occurs where Stenberg drops, in the Blackhawks' laps, he's there for, it's a no-brainer. You take Stenberg at 4 if he's there. I think he would be the ideal wingman for Bedard. This team has been missing, right? Left wing on the left side. He is a bit smaller, 5'11", 183, but, the Hawks have smaller players than that, right? He's not tiny, I'd say he's middle of the road from that standpoint, right? Hawks have a lot of kind of 5'11", 180-ish type players, so he would kind of fit into that mold, right? He's had a very impressive junior career in Sweden, as you could see here. Very good season this past year, 33 points at 43 games in the top Swedish Hockey League this year. Actually outproduced Anton Frundell, right? I believe Frundell had 20 goals, 8 assists, 28 points at 43 games in the same league, albeit a different team. Stenberg actually outproduced Frundell despite being a year younger, despite being in his draft years. Because Frundell obviously was his draft 1 year. So very impressive season from Stenberg, right? As a teenager in Sweden, to be producing at that rate was very impressive. In fact, for much of the year, at least for the first half of the year, a lot of projections, a lot of rankings actually had Stenberg ahead of McKenna. For at least half of the season, there was a thought that Stenberg actually could go number 1. Second half of the year, I think McKenna sort of was able to separate himself from the pack and kind of assert himself in that number 1 spot. But from the beginning of the year, I'd say to the World Juniors, I think Stenberg was, favored to go number 1. He had a very impressive World Junior tournament for Sweden as well at 10.7 games. Was one of Sweden's best players, right? He and Frundell were together on that Swedish team. Were probably their 2 best players in the tournament. So, Stenberg had a fantastic season, both for his team in Sweden and also the international level for Sweden, the World Junior Championships. He also played for Sweden in the World Championships as well. Did very good in that tournament as well. So all around a very impressive season for Stenberg. He's a teenager playing against men at one of the top levels of hockey is very impressive from him. So I think he'd be a great wingman for Bedard. I think the two would work well together. I think Stenberg, from the tape I've seen, very good skater, very good vision, very complete player, very good positionally, just a smart player, high hockey IQ, good playmaker, good shot in him as well, although I would say he's more of a playmaker. So I think pairing his playmakers with Bedard's shot, would be an elite combo. It'll be nice, man. It would be nice if Stenberg fell to the Blackhawks' laps. I think it would make Davidson passing up Demidov sort of. It would kind of forgive him for that, for that decision. But unfortunately, it's not looking super likely that occurs. With that said, though, I don't think the Canadians. I think there's a thought. There were some question marks if Demidov was going to fall to them at 5, right? So maybe Stenberg falls to 4. You never know. He is a winger, and you rarely see two wingers go up the top of the draft, right? Normally centers and defensemen get bumps in their stock compared to wingers. Stenberg is a winger, an undersized winger at that. So maybe for that reason he falls, and for the Sharks, you look at what they need. They really could use a top defenseman in that pool, but just Mike Greer has always been their general manager. He's always been a best player available type of GM. It's a thought he used back in 2023 when he selected Will Smith, 24 selected Macklin Celebrini, 25 selected Michael Misa. So he has selected forwards each of the last 3 drafts with their top picks, right? Smith was a 4th overall pick. Celebrini was the 1st overall pick, and then Misa was the 2nd overall pick. So with yet another top 4 pick for the 4th draft in a row, I think it would make sense for Greer to pick a defenseman, because you look at their pool, outside of Sam Dickinson on the left side, they really are lacking a top defensive prospect there. They have some middle-of-the-road guys who are solid, but besides Dickinson, they don't have a surefire, top 4 defenseman in that pool. So or top pair defense, if that matters. So I do think it would make sense from a positional standpoint for the Sharks to pick a defenseman, but just knowing Mike Greer, he's always been a general manager who's picked, is drafted at the top of the draft based off of best player available. And Stenberg, if he's going to be drafted again off of that philosophy, Stenberg is the 2nd best player in this draft after Gavin McKenna. In fact, there's a debate too. He could be right up there with McKenna for number 1 too, but there is a thought too, Europeans sometimes don't get as much of a bump in their stock compared to North American players, and that maybe could be playing against them. But no, knowing Greer and knowing the Sharks, how they've been drafting in recent seasons, despite the fact they already have a loaded forward pool, I still think they probably go with Stenberg at 2. It's just a nagging thought I've had, and it feels like the Sharks have always kind of been our way from that standpoint too, right? So I think Greer as well, knowing what the Blackhawks need, knowing how badly we want Stenberg, I think he would jump at the chance to kind of break Blackhawks fans' hearts there. So, and kind of screw over Davidson. So, yeah, I think, the Sharks, they got very fortunate to move number 2 in the draft lottery, but hey, it's a draft lottery. That stuff happens, right? That's why the lottery's there, right? It creates some unpredictability with the draft order, and the Sharks got lucky to move up to 2, and I think they're probably going to add yet another elite 4, to that pool. That already includes Celebrini. That already includes Misa. That already includes Smith, Chernyshev, Eklund, go down the list. I think for them, they probably then go another route when it comes to filling that defensive position, right? They probably go after somebody via trade, free agency, whatnot. They'll have to find another way to kind of find that top defensive player if they decide not to do in the draft. But we'll see. We'll see. Again, we won't know for sure until we won't know for sure until draft day in terms of what happens there. But I think the Sharks probably take Stenberg off the Blackhawks' hands. But yeah, if Stenberg is there, though, no, there's no debate, there's no decision, there's no choice to make here. Like Davidson, if Stenberg is there, Davidson is sprinting to the podium to select him. Like, you would take him in a heartbeat, because I do think Stenberg is kind of that last elite forward piece to the core that this team is missing, right? I think there's a lot of good pieces here between Bedard, between Frundell, between Nazar, between Kantsarov, Lardis, Moore, Green, go down the list. I do think they could use another solid piece there. I think Stenberg would be that guy. But yeah, unfortunately, I do think he's probably not going to be there at 4. I would be happily surprised, and I would love to be wrong. I hope he is, but yeah, we'll see what happens there, right? We'll see what happens. In the meantime, until draft day, we'll be praying, manifesting that could happen, but I'm just thinking most likely it doesn't occur. Yeah, but that's number 1. Number 2 on my board is Chase Reed, defenseman, right shot defenseman. Most scouts, most prospect gurus say that Reed is the top defenseman in this draft class. I've watched tape on all these guys, and I would tend to agree with that. Based on the tape I've seen, Chase Reed's tape has impressed me the most amongst the defensemen in this draft class. I do think if Reed is there for, I think if you're the Blackhawks, you should take him. I think he's a defenseman in this draft class. That is the best opportunity to be a number 1 play driving defenseman in the NHL, to be a potential power play quarterback, to be a 20-plus, 25-minute minute muncher who can play on both ends, who's got that offensive ability in his game as well from the back end. I think he's a guy who worked great in the Blackhawks power play, because I think right now that we don't really have a clear-cut guy for that position. Lepshinov could be a power play quarterback. Renzel could be a power play quarterback. Korchinski could be. None of them are certainties. I think Chase Reed, if he was selected, would be the top Blackhawks defenseman in the system. Yeah, I think Reed would make a ton of sense. Very good skater, very talented defenseman, right? He's been very impressive this past year in the OHL. He's been over a point per game player his past couple of years in the OHL as a teenager, so very impressive there. I thought, having watched the USA World Junior team, I thought he was amongst their best players in the tournament this year. It wasn't a very good year for the USA World Junior team. After gold medaling in consecutive years in 24, 25, they failed the medal this year as a weaker team compared to past seasons, but I thought Reed was amongst their better players. Had 4 points in 5 games in the tournament, and just in general I think was very impressive. Right? I think he was one of the more noticeable players for USA in the tournament. So I think if the Blackhawks are going to pick a defenseman, which I would prefer a forward. I would prefer if the Blackhawks picked a forward in this draft class. But if the Hawks were to take a defenseman, I think Reed would make the most sense. I think he's the defenseman that excites me the most. I think he has the biggest wow factor. I think he has the highest potential to be a star in the National Hockey League. Right? I think there's a lot of solid defensemen in this draft class. I think Reed, to me, seems like the defenseman who's the biggest X factor in that regard. Right? I think he's a defenseman with the most potential. So for me, if we're picking a defenseman, I think he would make a ton of sense. Good size too, 6'3", 195. So that's it would add some it would add more size to that back end. Which, to be fair, the Hawks do have a lot of defensemen with size. Size might be an issue at the forward core. It's not an issue at the Blackhawks D core. So Reed would add more to the plate there from that regard. The one issue of Reed, though, not that it's an issue per se, but he is a right shot defenseman. So if he were to take Reed, it would create a bit of a logjam of Artie and Renzel down the line. If Reed does project to be that first pair right shot defenseman that many people think he will be, it would create a bit of a conundrum with Lepshinov or Renzel down the line. You may have to move one of them out, because don't forget you also have Crevier back there. So yeah, I think if you're selecting Reed, from that standpoint, there would be a bit more of a logjam there. You look at the Blackhawks' left side's a bit more open compared to the right side, because you have Vlasic, you have Kaiser, but after that, there's not much certainty, because Korchinski, we don't know what he's going to be, and then there's Domasho is more of a third pair 7 defenseman guy. So the Hawks' left side is a bit more of a need from that standpoint. So if you are drafting based off of need, you might prefer picking a left shot defenseman, but if you're just drafting best off of best player available, which has always been the mode that I feel like if you're a GM and you have a top pick in the draft, you're picking the top 5, top 10. I'm always a believer that you should be picking based off of the best player available. And I think after Ivar Stenberg, I think Chase Reed is the best player that the Blackhawks could potentially land in this draft, right? So for me, he's number 2 on the board for that reason. I think Stenberg's the best forward that could be available. I think Chase Reed is the best defenseman that could be available. And that, it must be said, while the Blackhawks do have a lot of solid young defensive prospects in the system, there's not a lot of sure things there, right? I think Artie could be a top pair defenseman, but he has a long way to go. I think Renzel could be as well, a long way to go in his development. Vlasic, solid second pair guy. Kaiser, solid second, third pair guy. Korchinski at this point, who knows of him? He's a wild card. Domasho is an extra defenseman. There's not a lot of sure things. There's a lot of potential back there. There's not a lot of sure things. Crevier as well, solid second, third pair guy. More likely third pair guy. So yeah, I think the Hawks, they probably could use another, top defensive prospect back there. I think Chase Reed would be the best bet there. So, with that said, though, I think there's a good chance, if there is a defenseman that's picked before, pick number 4, I think it would be him. I think if the Sharks were to take a defenseman, it would be Chase Reed, because they got Dickinson the left side. I think Chase Reed is the best right shot. So, I think if the Sharks were to take a D-man, it would be Chase Reed. So, he might not be there for the Hawks. Just like Stenberg, good chance he's not there at 4. But if he is there at 4, and Stenberg's off the board, I think absolutely Chase Reed would be my pick. He'd be a very solid consolation prize. I do think he would kind of shore up that back end to kind of it would make it to where as well. Like, I don't think the Hawks would have to worry about the defense anymore, right? I think adding Chase Reed back there, would create a bit more stability back there. So yeah. Next up is Caleb Malhotra. He's number 3 on my board here. Caleb Malhotra is a center, the projected top center in this draft class, right? Because the top 2 forwards are both wingers, and McKenna and Stenberg. Malhotra, many scouts project to be the top center in this draft class, so that could give him a stock in his rankings, right? Had a very impressive season with Brantford Bulldogs in the OHL this past year. 84 points in 67 games, but it was really the playoffs where he was most impressive. He had 26 points, 15 games, was probably their best player in the playoffs. So another Brantford player as well. So the Blackhawks have a bit of a connection in Brantford as well. If you look at Nick Lardis, if you look at Merrick Van Acker, Parker Holmes, the Blackhawks, Davidson have made 3 draft picks from the Brantford organization in the past few years. So he does have a connection there. He didn't play with Lardis, but because Lardis he graduated by the time he showed up, but he did play with Merrick Van Acker this past year. Van Acker, obviously, one of the top prospects in the Blackhawks system, led the OHL in goals this past year, 47. So I think Malhotra, from that regard, he already has some chemistry with some of the Blackhawks prospects. He is a center as well. That's the thing, though, there as well, is like with the Blackhawks, with Davidson kind of seeing Bedard, Frundell, and Nazar being your 1, 2, 3 centers. I do think if you were to draft Malhotra, that would probably change those plans. With that said, the Blackhawks do seem to have a bit of a logjam when it comes to centers. I do think, the wing is a bit more of a need with this team. I think we're kind of set in terms of the center core, the center depth. I think the Blackhawks are set. It's the wings, I think, that need to be bolstered a bit. So for me, I would prefer to take a winger as opposed to a center with this draft pick. But if Stenberg is off the board, I think Malhotra is the clear-cut second best forward that would be available. So I think he wouldn't be a terrible consolation prize in that regard. I think he could be a solid second-line center down the road. I think the best thing about picking Malhotra is it will likely make it to where Frundell will most likely be moved to the wing. Right now, Frundell is likely going to be your second-line center in the future. I do think if Malhotra is the pick, that would probably change that plan. I think Malhotra would probably be your second-line center behind Bedard, who could kind of take those, defensive responsibilities in a second-line center role. Because Malhotra is, from what I've seen of his tape, he is a complete player. He has offensive game in his arsenal, but he can play on both sides of the puck. That's a guy you could probably put against other teams' top lines and kind of shoulder. You could kind of allow the Bedard line to kind of eat some maybe match up against some weaker lines in that regard, right? A lot of times having that solid second line center could kind of shut down your other team's top lines. Is a very valuable, it's a very valuable player to have. I think Malhotra has shown he has a solid defensive game in his arsenal. He could be that kind of solid second line center to kind of pair behind your top franchise center, that is Bedard. So I think Malhotra would make sense as a second line center. It'll allow you to move Frundell to Bedard's wing, where he probably should be, because we did draft Frundell to be Bedard's wingman. That was why we initially drafted him. Although right now it feels like the Blackhawks want to be a center. They're working towards making center, Frundell's primary position. So I think the top reason I think the draft Malhotra is it would allow you to move Frundell to Bedard's wing, where I think he probably should be, where I think he would make the most sense. I think Frundell's game, I think would complement Bedard very nicely, right? We saw it in spades this past year, but even when Frundell stint the Blackhawks this past year, he mostly played center. He didn't play a ton on the wing. So I do think, Frundell playing a Bedard make a ton of sense. I think the two would complement each other well. I think the two would have chemistry with each other. I think the two would get the best out of each other. So I think, that's another good reason I think the draft Malhotra there. So yeah, I think in terms of the fact that he's projected top center, I think he'd be a solid second line center for the future. It'll allow you to move Frundell to Bedard's wing. I think those are all very sound reasons. I think, to draft Malhotra, I think, to work in his favor there. So I would assume he'd be a second line center, right? Maybe it's Nazar as a second line then. If Frundell is moved to the wing, maybe Nazar is second line and Malhotra is third line. I'll probably project Malhotra ahead of Nazar from that regard. Maybe Nazar is still moved to the wing regardless. I don't know. Maybe both Frundell and Nazar moved to the wing. We'll see. But yeah, I think Malhotra for that regard, again, he might not be that forward that like wows you in the way that Stenberg does. His tape might not jump at you like Stenberg does, but he just seems like a solid, sound player. Doesn't make a ton of mistakes. Complete player, type of player I think that playoff teams would want. So I think Malhotra would not be a bad pick whatsoever. It might not be that sexy pick, but I think it would be a solid pick. Definitely could be a good player from this team down the line. So also as well, good frame here too. He's well over 6 feet, 180. Hawks have a lot of sort of sub 6 foot players. So Malhotra, the fact that he's a center and he's above 6 feet too, it's good to see that as well. So yeah, I think a lot of things to like about Malhotra. I think he'd be a solid pick. Maybe not. Maybe this wouldn't be a pick that would get you out of your seats like Stenberg or Chase Reed would. I do think he's a tier below those players. I'm not sure he's going to be a star in the National Hockey League per se in the NHL, but I think he's going to be a very good player, sound player, effective player in the NHL. So yeah, I think a type of player that I think a lot of teams would want. So yeah, Malhotra 3. Next up is Carson Carroll, is another defenseman, although he's a left shot, 6'2", 198, so good size there. Farm boy as well, another good Canadian farm boy here. So yeah, I think Carson Carroll, so similar to Chase Reed, I think many scouts project him to be a top pair defenseman in the NHL. The nice thing about Carroll is he's a left shot, which I do think that's probably, in terms of the defense, I think the left side is the weaker point right now for the Blackhawks. I think the right side between Artie and Rinzel, you have a pretty good, I think for Davidson, you have a pretty good, understand that I think, those guys could be your top two right shot of the future, right? It's not a guarantee there, but I think both of them have a lot of potential. Both of them have ways to go in their development, but I think the right side is more of a certainty compared to the left side for the Blackhawks. I think the left side is a bit more of a hole there. As much as I like Vlasic, I don't really see him as a first pair left shot. Same with Kaiser. I like Kaiser, don't see him as a first pair left shot. Korchinski for me, at this point, he's, again, like I said before, he's an uncertainty. It's not clear what he's going to be, if he's going to pan out for us. So I think with Carroll's, the thought that it could be your first pair left shot, you got Artie Renzel on your right side. That would give you a very solid top four. Then Vlasic on your second pair. That would give you a very solid top four to work with. So, and yeah, he's had a very impressive junior career, right? You look at his past year in the WHL, he had 73 points in 58 games. Very impressive junior career. Just like Chase Reed, he contribute on both ends, right? Very good offensively, very good defensively. Could be a power play guy as well. Could quarterback or power play too. So I think Carroll seems to be a very solid all-around defenseman. Maybe not quite the offensive firepower that Reed has, although I do think, based on the tape I've seen, I do think Carroll's might be a bit better defensively compared to Reed. I think that's an area that Reed could probably see some improvement. Carroll's from what I've seen, very solid defensively as well. But then he also has some offensive tools in his game too. But for me, I think just Chase Reed has a bit more, of an X factor to him. I think there's a bit more potential in his game compared to Carroll, so that's why I would take him ahead of Carroll's. Although with that being said, the fact that Carroll's is a left shot, I think from a positional standpoint, that would make more sense for the Blackhawks. So that could give him the edge over Reed in terms of, if the Blackhawks are picking best defenseman here, if all the forwards are off the board and they're picking best defenseman, I think Reed would be your guy. But I think from a positional standpoint, I think Carroll's, might make more sense in that regard. So I think you can't go wrong with either of them. I think, if you're picking defenseman, I think between Reed, Carroll's, don't think you could really go wrong there. Yeah, and also, represented Canada World Juniors as well. Didn't notice him as much as Reed. I think Reed was definitely, one of the USA's best players in the World Juniors. And Carroll didn't really notice as much, so I don't know if he played as much. But yeah, no, solid season, solid defenseman. Maybe less of a sure thing in terms of, I think Reed, very good chance is going to be a top pair, all-star type defenseman. Carroll's maybe a little less certainty there, right? If he's not a first pair, though, I think a good chance it will be at least a second pair. At the very least, should be a top four guy. So, which the Hawks probably could use another piece on that left side, especially if you're not feeling super confident. Korchinski and Carroll's might be your guy. So, if Carroll's was drafted, I do think good chance that probably bumps Korchinski out down the line. But we'll see. Obviously he's still got time to figure it out. But I do think that would create a bit of a conundrum there. But I think either way, there's going to be a conundrum. If the Blackhawks do pick a defenseman, there's going to be a conundrum either way. Between Levshina, between Renzel, between Korchinski, I have a hard time seeing all three of them, assert themselves as core defensive for this team down the line, right? I do think I'd probably bump one of them out, depending on what side they prioritize there. But we'll see what happens there. But no, I think Carson Carroll is, I think, from number 4 on my board. Again, similar to Malhotra, maybe not a sexy pick, right, compared to Stenberg. I think Stenberg or Reed are kind of, Stenberg's in his own tier, then I think it goes Reed. And then, Malhotra and Carroll's are sort of another tier below those guys. So again, still very sound picks, and to both be good players in the NHL. But will they be great? That's kind of the question mark, right? I think you feel very confident that Stenberg or Reed are going to be kind of those star needle mover type players. Malhotra and Carroll's, I think, are kind of a tier below that. But that's just my opinion, right? I'm not an expert when it comes to prospects, right? I've watched tape on these guys. I've seen the records, I've seen the stats, etc. But yeah, at the same time, though, you don't know exactly what these guys are going to be, right? We're basing this off of projections here. Until these guys arrive in the NHL, they're teenagers. You don't know exactly how they're going to pan out. So this is all just kind of a guessing game, going off of what the scouts have said in terms of best fit with the team as well. Where these players fit into in terms of the Blackhawks core, what makes the most sense in that regard, best fit. That's kind of how we're basing this all off of. But until these players show up to the NHL, you don't really know exactly what they're going to be, right? So, but yeah. Number 5 for me is Viho Bjork, a center. So just like Malhotra, he's a center. I like Theo Bjork a lot. I think he's a very skilled player. The reason why I don't think the Hawks would probably pick him is he's very undersized. He's 5'9", which is, very small. I think in today's NHL, I think the whole size thing is a bit overrated. I think there's been a lot of small players in the game that have shown that they can perform when it matters in the clutch. I think you look at a player like Logan Stanko for Carolina these past playoffs. You look at Cole Caulfield in Montreal. You look at DeBrincat in Detroit. Just go down the list. There's plenty of small players that have performed at NHL level today. I think that's not as much of a concern. I think maybe it was, back in the day. I think it's much easier in today's NHL. That's prioritizes skill for smaller players to translate the NHL. So I think with Bjork, he's got a a very impressive junior career in Sweden. Maybe not the same type of pop in his numbers compared to Stenberg, but very impressive junior career. Again, another player that was on that World Junior Gold Medal winning team for Sweden that featured Frundell, that featured Stenberg. Bjork also played in the same team as Anton Frundell. He played for Djurgården Swad in Sweden, so he does have chemistry with Frundell. He has that past relationship, camaraderie with Frundell, top Blackhawks prospect. So the fact that he already has chemistry with Frundell too, could be a guy you play from, right? Like you could see a Frundell Bjork connection at the Blackhawks. So that'd be pretty fun to watch. Though he is also a center, so maybe in that case he's a center. He's your second line center, then maybe Frundell moves to the wing. So yeah, I think Bjork as well. I think they would probably prefer Malhotra because he's got a bit more size and a bit more complete game. I think Bjork's got a bit more of an offensive arsenal. I think he's a bit more skilled, but he is a bit more undersized in that regard. So I think that's probably why they give Malhotra the nod. He is also European compared to North American here as well. Sometimes it does feel like North Americans tend to get a bit more of a bump in their stock compared to the Europeans, just because they often have more tape on them. The scouts tend to have more tape on these guys compared to the European players. But no, for Bjork, I think very impressive junior career. I like him. Like I'd be cool if it's not Stenberg. I think Bjork would be a sound option. Although I do think there is a debate they'll pick him at 4. Might be a bit early if you were to take Bjork. There is the thought maybe you trade back to take him, right? Similar to the whole Stenberg thing. Like if the Blackhawks want Stenberg, very low likelihood is going to be their 4. Maybe is if the Hawks want Stenberg, they're probably going to have to trade up. And it's sort of an opposite scenario of Bjork. If the Blackhawks want Bjork, take him at pick 4 might be a bit early. You might want to trade down and take him a bit later. Or you just pull Anaheim and take him at 4, right? It could be our Seneca, right? So from that regard. So, take him at pick 4 might be a bit of a surprise. It might be perceived as a bit early, but maybe that pans out for you, right? We'll see, right? So could be a bit of an off-the-board pick at 4, but, if you're going to take an off-the-board player, I think Bjork would be the guy for me that I'd be interested in taking. I think he's the player there that has probably the most upside in terms of, beyond, because, there's not a ton of forwards that's at the top of this draft that, that are kind of on the table here, because McKenna's going to be off the board. Between Malhotra, there's not a ton after that. I think if it's not going to be Stenberg or Malhotra, I think Bjork's probably the only forward that I'd probably be considering at 4. Is really no other forward for me that pick 4. I think about there's other solid forwards like Belchets. He could be a solid power forward. Teenan Lawrence as well, solid center. But I wouldn't ponder either of those players at pick 4. I think those are players that you'll see kind of lower, in the draft. Kind of middle of the first round as opposed to top 5, top 10. So, but yeah, I like Bjork, but I'd be surprised. I don't think the Hawks would probably be seriously. I don't think he'd be high in the Blackhawks board just based off of the size concerns. Although maybe the fact that he has that rep of Frundell, maybe that gives him a bit of a bump, but probably not a guy that's like super high on the Hawks board, but I do think he's a guy that wouldn't be a terrible dark horse selection for the reasons I mentioned. Next up is Albert Schmitz. He's number 6 on my board. Another defenseman, left shot defenseman, similar to Carroll's. He's Latvian. 18, 6'3", 205. Nice thing about Schmitz, good size in him too. And based off of what I see the tape, he definitely has a bit of a mean streak to him. He's definitely a bit of a beast, a bit of an animal from that regard. I will say though, watching his tape, I do get some Artie vibes. So if you're a big Artie guy, then you'll love this pick. If you're not an Artie guy, you probably won't love this pick. So they're different players. I'm not necessarily comparing them from that regard, but in terms of comps, I do see a bit of shades of Artie there. So yeah, I think Schmitz, he's solid defensively from what I've seen the tape. He also, very impressive. He actually represented Latvia in both the World Juniors and Olympics this past year. He's had a very good World Junior tournament with them and also played at the Olympics as well. And, pretty solid there. So, yeah, DC for him in Europe, playing against men, had a pretty solid season there. Yeah, I think Schmitz for me, like in terms of defensemen, I wouldn't consider picking him over either of Reed or Carroll's. I think he's a notch below him, right? I think it would go for me. It goes Reed, Carroll's, and then Schmitz, Vierhoff. If it was pick 6, 7, maybe, but pick 4, I wouldn't select him over Reed or Carroll's. I think in terms of left shot, I think Carroll's your best bet there. Schmitz in that regard, I mentioned earlier the left side's a bit more of a knee compared to the right side, so that's kind of another variable that kind of favors Schmitz. But if you're picking a left shot defenseman, I'd rather it be Carroll's. Assuming he's available at 4, which I think he probably will be. I'd much rather prefer that pick compared to Schmitz. But yeah, I do think with Schmitz, he does provide some traits that maybe this team's lacking a bit. He does seem to provide some physicality, which his team is lacking a bit of that. He does seem to use his body well, which some of these defensemen maybe don't. So I think he does provide some bit more, X factor type traits there. But Schmidt seems like another player though, where it's like you see, similar to Artie. It feels like we picked him based more off of what we want him to be versus what he is. I just fear Schmidt to be a similar deal, where you're picking him based off of hypothetical, how you envision him being versus just what you see, presently. So I think he'd be a decent option here, but he's not the guy that I would take a pick for, right? He's not the guy to take a pick for. In terms of defenseman, he's probably number 3 on my board. So I'd be surprised if he's the pick, right? Yeah, he doesn't wow me as much as either Reed or Carroll's does. I'm not sure how much offensive ability he has as well. I think he's decent defensively, but I don't think he has that same level of offensive game in him compared to Carroll's and Reed. I don't think this would be a power play quarterback, although he probably could be pretty solid the penalty kill, but not like we don't have guys there. So yeah, I mean Smith's solid defenseman, but not a guy I would seriously consider a pick for. And then last on my board, pick 7 here is Keenan Vierhoff. Pretty much copy paste the points I made for Schmitz. Number 7 on my board, right shot defenseman. Although I like it again, I would definitely, if we're picking a right shot defenseman, I think I would take Reed over Vierhoff. Vierhoff, his stock was a bit higher at the start of the year. I think his stock dropped as the season progressed. He had a decent season in college. He's one of those players like Gavin McKenna, right? He made that transition from the WHL to the college ranks there. So similar to McKenna there, he made that transition from the Canadian major junior ranks to college hockey, and he had a solid season, right? I think, but maybe not quite, as sound a year as you would have expected. I think before the season, I think many people thought he'd be the top defenseman in this class. I mean, most projections had him as the top-ranked defenseman, and in fact, he was on many boards. He was number 2 behind McKenna before the season started, and just don't think he quite had the season people expected. It's still a solid year, decent term as well for Canada and the World Juniors. But yeah, for me, I would say in terms of defenseman, he's probably the one on the Hawks board that probably has impressed me the least in terms of his tape. I do think he has a bit of upside as well, though. I will say that. Although he's a defenseman that I think, watching his tape, I do think he's a ways away. And the Hawks already have a lot of young defensemen, I think, that are ways away in their development. I think you'd just be adding another defenseman here who, years and years down the line could be a very solid defenseman, although I think that defenseman is a while away. So I'd rather take a defenseman if you're going to pick, a blue liner. I'd rather take a defenseman that I think would have a more seamless transition in the NHL. I think both, from what I've seen out of Reed and Carroll's, I think both of them would make that transition a bit faster than Vierhoff would. I think any defenseman you're taking, though, probably wouldn't play for the Blackhawks next year. Probably be, a couple of years down the line, probably 27, 28 earliest. Although I do think some defensemen would probably make that transition a bit quicker. Vierhoff, for me, feels like the defenseman of the 4 that I mentioned that seems the furthest away, although I do think he has some decent upside in his game as well. But yeah, for me, though, he's probably the defenseman that wows me the least on this board. I have him here at pick 7, but for me, of the defensemen on this board, he's the one for me that's impressed me the least from the tape I've seen, but that's just my opinion, right? This is just one man's opinion. Of course, I'm sure the Blackhawks, scouts and, team that's doing this would have different opinions than me. I'm sure many fans have different opinions than me, but that's what makes us all fun to do, right? It'd be pretty boring if we all have the same opinions and everything, right? So that's just my opinion, right? And that's pretty much it for this board. There are other players that could be up for consideration here. Jackson Rudolph, another defenseman that I thought about including here, but so I'll include Jackson Rudolph as an honorable mention. He's my honorable mention. Yeah, I mean, like I said, there's some other forwards, Belchitz, Lawrence, but I don't think they'd be considered 4. Wyatt Colin as well, another guy that could be considered. But yeah, that's it. This is just for pick 4 as well. I'm not getting into the second round today. The Hawks do have other picks beyond pick 4. They have 8 picks in this draft, including 3 picks in the second round. If I'm gonna be honest with you, there's a reason I've only really been doing draft content focused on pick 4, because I'm just not super interested in what happens beyond pick 4. This is the draft number 5, I believe. Yes, this is draft number 5, the Davidson regime. We've made 11 first-round picks the last 4 years, including we've had a top 4 pick, in the last 3 drafts. So this will be the 4th draft in a row we've had a top 4 pick. So for me, it gets to a point where, you kind of get some draft fatigue when it comes to this. So this is really the last draft, I think, as I mentioned many times. I hope this is the last draft for a while. The Blackhawks will be picking near the top. I'm hoping starting next year that we'll be kind of taking those steps forward and kind of, veering away from the draft lottery race and then kind of entering that playoff race instead. So I'm hoping this is the last draft that's of utmost importance to this team. So for that reason, I do think this pick 4 is important because it could be the last top pick we make for a while. So I do think this is a super important pick with number 4, so you want to get it right. With that being said, though, there is another debate too. There's a good chance that none of these players that I mentioned here are picked because the Hawks could move pick 4, right? That's another question mark as well. The Hawks could move pick 4. With that said, though, it does feel like we hear those rumors pretty much every year that teams could be moving their top picks. It's pretty rare you actually see teams move their top picks. If a team has a top 5 pick, more often than not, they're going to use it, right? You see some smoke screens. You see a lot of smoke screens this time of year, right? I'm sure the Hawks will at least consider it. If there's a trade on the table for pick that involves pick 4, If Stenberg's off the board, especially, I'd be open to moving it, right? If Stenberg's off the board at pick number 4, I'd be open to moving that pick for the right price. If it lands you a Matthew Nyes, somebody like that, I'd be open to it. But for me, though, I think that's unlikely for me. I'd be surprised if it happens. I think we hear it a lot, and rarely, if ever, do we see a big time trade there. But if there was a year to do it, this would be the year. There's also the question mark too, could the Hawks, potentially be picking up a different pick as opposed to pick 4, right? Could they move up or down, right? If they moved up, could they try to trade up with Vancouver and San Jose to get Stenberg? I think it's unlikely. I think it's unlikely that San Jose, Chicago would make a deal considering they're going to be rivals for the foreseeable future. I just don't see Davidson wanting to give San Jose additional assets just to move up a couple spots. Yes, it would guarantee you Stenberg, but you'd also be bolstering San Jose in terms of their pool. So I'd be surprised if a trade happened between Sharks and Hawks for pick 2 and 4, but I wouldn't be completely opposed to it if it got a Stenberg. I wouldn't be opposed to giving up, if they have to give up, a couple, big pieces in terms of draft picks, in terms of prospects that do it. I wouldn't be opposed to it in terms of the overflowing cover of prospects and picks we have. I think I wouldn't be opposed to using some of them in a package, in a trade, but as well, again, as I was mentioning before, in terms of all the other picks we have, I think another kind of topic to talk about this draft too is is the middle round picks, right? The Blackhawks have 3 second round picks. For me, I don't think the Hawks have any reason to have to use all those picks. If you can package a few of those picks, in a deal to acquire, an asset that could help us win right now, I wouldn't be opposed to doing that, right? Knowing Davidson, I'll probably just do it to get another, first round pick, because Davidson has had, multiple first round picks every year since he's been GM. 2022 he had 3, 2023 he had 2, 2024 he had 3, 2025 he had 3 as well. So knowing Davidson, instead of acquiring players that could, we can insert in his team right now, veteran players that we can insert in his team right now, he'll probably just use those draft picks to acquire more draft picks. But I'd love to be wrong there. We'll see what happens, right? Early days of the offseason, we got a long way to go here. So, but yeah, in terms of the draft, right, that's the main topic of discourse right now. But of course, there's other areas to monitor this offseason for Davidson. We've been talking about, we'll continue to talk about it, right? But should be a busy week ahead with the draft Friday, Saturday in Buffalo, New York. We will be covering it, and we'll see what happens round 1 Friday and rounds 2 through 7 on Saturday. But yeah, that's pretty much all I got for this one. That's all I got for my board here. Thank you all so much for watching this video. This is Justin Lynch, Blackhawks Memes out. If you like this video, feel free to like it and subscribe to the channel if you want more content. And if you want to hype the video up, hype the video on YouTube, help me out a lot. That helped the video reach more traction. And yeah, that's all I got for this one. Thank you all so much for watching. This is Justin Lynch, Blackhawks Memes out. Now I'll see y'all in the next one, baby. Bye-bye. Absolute cinema. Boop.